Although this bridge is not the first occasion for cinematic physics in the episode, it was the original test subject we used to develop our effects. In early prototypes, the bridge started off in its broken position. It was a static object the player had to navigate to retrieve the car. When we incorporated the cinematic physics, we thought this bridge would be a great opportunity for players to see an immense piece of the environment transform before their eyes. The bridge collapse not only showcases the cinematic physics, it reminds players of the growing threat from the super portal, and sets up a navigational puzzle they must use the car to solve.
I don't think I really got the full scope of what Alex Vance is or how she's created until the first time that I went to Valve headquarters. And what was really important was that I got a better idea of how big the team was. I mean, a lot of people work really hard to make Alex Vance who she is. And I mean, you hear my voice and, you know, it's easy to say, oh, that's Alex, or Jamil is Alex, but that is so not the case. These people spend hours in front of their computer or writing their scripts or dreaming up this beautiful person, and it really just, I'm just the cake topping, really.
Having decided that we were going to rely on a car to get to White Forest, we had to figure out how to get Alex into the vehicle. Games often accomplish this by moving their characters close to the vehicle and then teleporting them inside in a very visible and jarring manner. We knew this would ruin Alex's believability as a character, so she had to smoothly get into a vehicle the way you would expect a person to in real life. This was no small task, given all the strange angles and positions the player could work the vehicle into. Alex also needed multiple entries into a vehicle, given that the doorway she wanted to use could be blocked or otherwise inaccessible. This also provided interesting moments for Alex, where she could vault over the hood of the vehicle in a very heroic fashion. The interaction between her and the vehicle was intriguing just by itself. Once we were sure she could enter and exit the vehicle convincingly, we then had the task of making her believable as she sat next to you. Our first experiments revolved around Alex reacting to the physical nature of the vehicle. When it crashed into a wall, she needed to be jolted. When you went around a bend, she needed to lean with the momentum of the car. These details were crucial in making her feel like she was really going along for the bumpy ride with you. We also wanted her to be very aware of her surroundings and what the player was doing while in the vehicle. If you ran over a zombie, she needed to echo the internal reward the player felt for accomplishing the feat. If you were about to hit the wall, we wanted her to flinch and react to the impending collision, much as the player at home would be doing. There was a fine balance between making her too much of a backseat driver or having her be too quiet next to you. Ultimately, we wanted Alex's presence in the vehicle to seem so natural that players would never consider it anything other than normal.
The original Episode 2 vehicle was dubbed the Jalopy, which says something about how uncool it was. Early feedback was that it seemed too similar to the Half-Life 2 buggy. So we decided to redesign it so that players would feel excited rather than disappointed when they saw the car. Alex's original line when she first saw the Jalopy echoed the feelings of many early viewers. "What a wreck. Forget about White Forest. We'll be lucky if we make it to the end of the block."
Even though this compound appears open and nonlinear, we're striving for a fairly reliable progression of events so that we can fine-tune pacing. The building on the right is bright and eye-catching, with the intention of drawing the player there first. The entrance to the ruin building is around the back, so that initial exploration through the center of the compound tends to lead to the radio room first. The drop-down entrance from the roof of the ruin building also helps us pace the experience, because players are cautious about committing to a space until they've explored the alternatives.
This room is designed so that the player will notice the main set of plugs right away, but is less likely to spot the second set at first. One end of the long cable is already plugged in, encouraging the player to grab the loose end and put it into the powered socket. This makes the faulty wire break loose and spark. With the power on, players try to return upstairs only to discover that now the elevator needs power. At this point, they look about more carefully and discover the elevator sockets. The short cord is tucked next to the elevator sockets, so that they're likely to try to use it there first, before realizing they need a longer one. Given this fairly reliable progression of events, we were able to write a limited number of lines for Alex so that she could react each time the puzzle changed state.
In earlier versions of the Hunter intro, the Hunters burst physically into the room by shouldering their way through the door. As the Hunter's flechette attack came online, we decided this was no longer appropriate. Now that the Hunter had an effective ranged attack, having him burst into the room with you actually put him into his least viable tactical position during the very first encounter, making him seem ineffective and a bit dumb. The current design is intended to showcase his abilities while giving the player the time and space to understand the situation before pushing out into close combat.
This area is designed to train the player in the art of hunter combat, and during the development process it changed continually to suit the hunter's behavior. The first hunter prototypes could be killed only by the blunt impact of physics objects. Therefore, to make sure the player learned this technique, we trapped him in this area with one hunter and kept him locked in until he defeated it. Upon the hunter's death, reinforcements broke down the gate and doors, opening up the arena. As time went on and the hunter was modified to make it vulnerable to all types of damage, our grip on the player gradually relaxed, permitting freedom of movement and a wider range of tactics right from the start of the encounter.
Oh, the other thing that's so great about acting for video games, and I guess voiceover in general, but for this particular game, is so amazing. I don't have to worry about hitting my mark, or playing to the camera, or forgetting my lines. That's usually my biggest thing. You can see the wheels turning on camera because I'm trying to keep up with my lines. But this, they're all right there, so I don't even have to worry about that, and I can just worry about the delivery, the emotional vibe that needs to come across, and just be the sense of immediacy. I don't even have to worry about the words. So that takes a whole other level off to let the actor just get down and into the work, which is really, really great, which is why I love this job.
The scene where Alex sees the Hunters for the first time since her injury was meant to be a turning point for her as a character, and an emotional highlight for the episode, both for Gordon and for Alex.
Let's try the transmitter before.
One reason we had a Hunter injure Alex in the beginning of the episode was so she could have a strong emotional reaction to the creatures, and use the start of combat as a way of building a good character moment. Alex's previous encounter has given her a visceral fear of Hunters, but now she has to make a conscious choice to get past her fear and into the right state for fighting them. She uses anger to get there. We also use Alex's intensity to draw the player's attention to subtler aspects of the scene, getting the player in position for the best view of the Hunters as the attack gets underway.
In this brief transmission scene, we are restating the goals of the level, while introducing a note of uncertainty and developing Dr. Magnuson's character. This scene was not strictly necessary, but it helped players feel some connection to Dr. Magnuson when they finally reached White Forest, and met him in person for the first time.
Well, let's give it a try.
In earlier versions, we tried having the Hunters cut the power and interrupt the transmission, but this felt arbitrary. Players were more receptive to this scene after they had solved the power puzzles and survived Hunter combat. It feels like a small reward in addition to the simple satisfaction of beating the Hunters.
To understand the gravity of the situation. The survival of Earth depends on the data you carry.
Yes, I know, but... Look! It's one of those advisor pods. Back in the Citadel, those things we saw.
This crashed advisor pod is a bit of storytelling embedded in the landscape. It hints at what lies ahead, while suggesting what must have happened in this location only a few hours before Gordon and Alex arrived. By placing artifacts of this sort throughout the episode, we slowly bring advisors into the foreground and develop their importance to the story in a way that doesn't depend on stage dramatic scenes.
The barn scene was critical both to this episode and to the development of advisors as characters in the series. They represent another intersection of story and gameplay concerns. This is the first time the player actually interacts with an advisor, and determining the right level of interactivity was tricky, especially given the player's reasonable expectation that he'll get to fight them directly at some point. Therefore, we wanted to show that they were powerful, but not invulnerable.
There we go.
This was a long-term goal. For the short term, we wanted to get the player familiar with some advisor behavior, so that when the episode finale occurred, they would already understand how advisors operate. By showing the advisor fumbling with an inert object, then a dead rebel, and finally grabbing the player, we allow the player to observe behavior and then gradually make it more and more of a direct threat. This all serves as foreshadowing for the episode's finale.
This swirling debris effect uses much of the same underlying technology that powers our other cinematic physics events in Episode 2, but with a few important differences. Firstly, instead of using primitives, every slat, tile, and beam was modeled before being sent to the rigid body solder. Next, there was a large focus on hand-sculpting world forces in order to achieve a particular behavior in the debris. Beyond the basics of gravity and collisions, we created spiral vortices, gravity wells, and some other more complex forces. With over 1,800 individually calculated dynamic moving parts, for a 30-second period, this simulation represents the largest amount of animation data run through our game engine to date.
Oh my god.
We've gotten better at building combat spaces that are open and tactically versatile, while still directing the player toward an optimal play experience. This combat is on its face pretty straightforward, but we're doing some subtle things to keep the experience even and well-paced. We're using quite a few of our combat tools in this one scene. As the first soldiers enter the barn, we send them in the right direction with an initial cue about the player's location using an NPC enemy finder. The first soldiers serve primarily to draw the player outwards, where the real meat of the combat takes place. The wave of soldiers that spawns as the player rounds the corner to the exit are the most directly controlled. One pair uses assault points to dash across the open ground and flank the player on the right. Others are constrained to hint groups in and around the house across the way, spaced so that the player is hit with an even front of fire, keeping them pinned for a while and encouraging cautious sniping and probing at the windows and doors. The broken down truck gives a vital bit of mid-ground cover as players leave the barn and advance on the house. Finally, as the player leaves the barn, we spawn the reinforcing hunter. We hold this back both to keep the difficulty more even, and because the hunter combat is better when the player has pushed outwards before it begins.
Our playtesters loved to see the zombie jump on the front of the car, and this naturally encouraged us to want to do more of it. We started off with a high frequency of occurrences of this behavior, treating the zombie leap as a gameplay element that could be played out in variations. Eventually, though, we discovered that this didn't lead to any really interesting gameplay, so we ended up creating just one memorable showcase of the event instead.
Boy, are we glad to see you guys.
Originally, the Episode 2 chopper battle was a classic fight that relied on the use of the RPG. In the meantime, we were experimenting with a completely new way of fighting the chopper, which we had hoped to have ready for Episode 3.
We need to get back on the road, but
the early Episode 3 experiments were so successful that we pulled them straight into Episode 2.
Tools? Got a whole shop over here. Come on, we'll get you set up.
Having solved the problem of getting Alex into the passenger seat, we were faced with the challenge of making her a useful companion. When we first hooked up her vehicle combat, Alex constantly targeted and fired her gun at everything. This made her feel a bit like a turret. In response, we tuned her behaviour so that while the vehicle is moving, Alex fires more slowly, taking more time to aim at high speeds.